For the melting point exercise, we'll need a few different items. We're going to use the chemicals nicotinamide and acetylsalicylic acid. We're going to place them in 2 weigh boats, and we're going to use 2 different scupulas to avoid contamination. We also need a test tube for a mixture of the 2 chemicals, as well as some melting point tubes. You will also need a Digimelt in order to record the melting point ranges. In the next part of the lab, we're going to place a little bit of each compound into a weigh boat. And we're going to use nicotinamide first. So I'm going to use a scupula, and I'm going to scoop just a little bit of the compound into the weigh boat. Then I'm going to place a little bit of acetylsalicylic acid into its own weigh boat, and I'm using a different scupula in order to avoid cross-contamination. Now I'm going to prepare my melting point tubes. So I'm going to grab a few capillary tubes here. They are a bit fragile, so you'll want to be careful when placing them on the countertop. Here you can see that there is a closed end to the capillary and an open end to the capillary. Now I'm going to place the open end of the capillary in the compound, nicotinamide, and we're just going to get a little bit of compound in the open end of the capillary. So you can see I have just a little bit. I'm going to tap off the excess, and then in the next step I'm going to try to get the compound into the bottom of the capillary. So I'm going to tap the capillary on the countertop in order to move the compound to the bottom. And this is just a gentle tapping. So here you can see we now have some compound in the bottom. I did this 2 more times so that I had 3 total samples for nicotinamide. Now I'm going to do the same thing for acetylsalicylic acid. So I'm going to get a little bit of compound in my melting point tube, just by tapping gently. And then I'm going to tap the capillary tube on the countertop so that the compound falls to the bottom of the tube. And this might take a few taps, it might take a lot of taps, it kind of depends. Now I'm going to do this 2 more times so I have a total of 3 samples for acetylsalicylic acid. Now we're going to make a mixture of our 2 compounds. So we'll need a test tube as well as a spatula. The scupula is probably too big for this test tube. So I'm going to grab a spatula for this part. But I'm also going to use my original scupulas for each compound so I don't cross-contaminate them when I'm dipping them into each container. So notice I'm using my nicotinamide scupula and just getting a little bit of compound. You don't need much. Alright, and then we're going to do the same thing with acetylsalicylic acid and add a little scoop to the test tube. So you'll notice that I really didn't put much into the test tube. And now I'm going to mix the 2 compounds using a spatula. Make sure it's mixed fairly well before you place any in your capillaries. Now we're going to make up our 3 different melting point tubes for the mixture. So we'll use the same method we did before. We're going to gently tap the capillary to get the mixture to the bottom of the capillary. And we'll do this 2 more times. All right, this is the Digimelt, which we'll be using to record the melting point ranges for our different samples. And there are instructions on the front that you can read if you're ever confused about how to use a Digimelt, but we'll walk through it together. So you'll need to plug in the Digimelt into an outlet, and then there is a power button on the back. When you turn the Digimelt on, you'll notice that the temperature reading shows up at the top, and there's also a light that appears so you can see your samples. All right, on the front, we have a few different options. We have a start temp button, a ramp rate button, and a stop temp button. There's also a start stop button. All right, so let's actually go through some of these instructions. So the first thing you're going to do is press Start Temp, which is the first yellow button. And then you'll use the arrow keys, which are buttons number 2 and 3, to set the start temperature. And then you're going to press Start Temp again to end. Next, you'll repeat step 1 for the ramp rate and the stop temperature. Then you'll press Start Stop, and then you're going to see the preheat button light up. So as the temperature is ramping up to the start temperature, eventually you'll see the ready light turn on, and that means that the Digimelt is ready for your sample to be inserted. So once you have your sample in there, then you're going to record the melting point temperatures, so the initial point and the final point. And we're going to do that manually. And then after all your samples have been melted, then you're going to press Start Stop again, and you'll see the cooling button light up. So in that section there that I just pointed to, you can see that there are 3 different slots for your melting point capillaries. So you could record up to 3 different samples at once, and you can see where we insert the capillaries at the top. I'm only going to record 1 at a time, just to keep things a little simpler. So let's set up for our first sample. So I'm going to hit Start Temp, and this is set pretty high at 145 degrees Celsius. So I'm going to lower that to 50 degrees Celsius because we don't know the melting point of this compound, so we want to make sure that we cover a wide range for our first trial or our rough trial. All right, and then the ramp rate we're going to set pretty high at 5 degrees Celsius per minute, so that means that the temperature will increase 5 degrees per minute. The stop temp will leave pretty high since we don't know the melting point of our compound. Next, we're going to put our first nicotinamide sample into the Digimelt. Now, you can wait to put this in later when the Digimelt says it's ready, but since we're starting at a fairly low temperature, it should be fine to put it in for now. All right, and then you'll see me adjusting the settings to try to highlight the solid a little better in the viewpoint. And now I'm going to hit Start, and now it is preheating. So I will fast forward through this part until we hit 50 degrees Celsius. All right, so now the Digimelt is ready for our sample to start heating up and melting. So what we're going to do is press start again, and then we will let it melt. So I'm going to jump ahead to the initial melting point so you don't have to sit through all of these temperature changes. All right, so the nicotinamide sample has not melted and we're up at 126 degrees Celsius, but we are getting close to the expected melting point range for nicotinamide. So we will pause here and watch and see if the solid starts to melt. I'm starting to notice some slight changes here to the solid sample, and it looks like it's starting to melt. So we should probably write down about 129.5 degrees Celsius for the initial melting point. And then when it's done melting, we'll write down the final melting point range. So that's about 131 degrees Celsius. And feel free to rewind and rewatch to get a more exact melting point range for this product. I also press stop, and now the Digimelt is going to cool. So I'm going to cool this to 10 degrees below the melting point range for my next sample. And for the next sample, we're going to reduce the ramp rate and get a more exact melting point range for nicotinamide. When you're done with your capillary tube or melting point tube, you're going to dispose of this in our used melting point tube glass jar. So it will join the thousands of other melting point tubes that have been used. Now we're going to set up for our first attempt at determining the melting point range for nicotinamide. So I'm setting the starting temperature at 120 degrees Celsius, which is about 10 degrees lower than our expected melting point. And the ramp rate will be set to 2 degrees Celsius per minute so we can get a more exact melting point range. And then finally, we're going to set the stop temperature at 250. And it doesn't matter really how high the final temperature is as long as we have it higher than our expected melting point. All right, let's press start and we will preheat the Digimelt to 120 degrees Celsius. So I'll fast forward through this part. All right, so now it is ready. So I'm going to place our second sample of nicotinamide in, and we're going to track the melting point range of this solid. So I might fast forward just a little bit again until we hit our initial melting point. So here the sample is starting to change a little bit, which means it's probably approaching its initial melting point. So feel free to write down a value for your initial melting point for nicotinamide the first attempt. And then once everything has melted, you'll want to write down a final melting point as well. And remember, you can always rewind if you need to get more exact numbers. All right, this is our second attempt for nicotinamide. So you'll want to record the initial melting point and the final melting point to get your melting point range. I'm going to fast forward the video again until we get closer to the melting point. Okay, so we're starting to see some changes here. So if you want to start keeping track of the initial and final melting points, please write them down in your lab assignment. You can find the data for acetylsalicylic acid and the mixture in your lab assignment on Canvas, just to spare you having to watch all of those melting point ranges. When you're done with your melting point exercise, you'll dispose of the solids in the solid waste jar. And this is different from the melting point tube waste jar. Now, let's say you're measuring out your initial amount of each solid and you have too much. Ask a neighbor if they need some. Or if nobody needs any extra, just dispose of it in this solid waste jar. We don't want to put it back into the original jar because that could contaminate it. You'll also notice I spilled some solid on the countertop, so I'm going to clean that up with a damp paper towel. And that is the end of the melting point exercise. If you have any questions, please let me know.